Hi, it's Paddy Hirsch at Marketplace. Today I want to talk about ring fencing. This is something that people have been talking about with regard to rescuing troubled nations in Europe, specifically France, Italy, and Spain. These are countries that haven't actually required a bailout yet, and the last thing we want to do is to have to bail them out because they'll be very, very expensive. So the idea is to ring fence them instead. So what exactly does that mean? Well, a good way to think about a ring fence is to think about a zoo, all right? We have animals in the zoo and they need to be fenced off and enclosed, to make sure that there's no problems there. So what animal would Italy be? I think Italy would be a wolf, given old Romulus and Remus and all that history. So here's our wolf in the zoo, and we'll call her Italia. Okay, there she is. And Italia needs her own little environment, all right? So they put an enclosure around her. They ring fence her, and they do this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because she's got lots of spectators there looking at her, and some of these spectators might be rude and they might sort of shout at her and maybe throw stuff. And there's a danger, of course, that Italia might get out, and because the wild animal can wreak havoc amongst the general population. That's a problem. So you want to protect people on the outside from the wolf. You also want to protect the wolf on the within the enclosure for another reason. You don't want to put other animals in there. You want to isolate the wolf, because if you've got sort of giraffes and hares and gazelles and things in there, then you could have all sorts of problems. But also because Italia needs special care, all right? This wolf needs to be looked after in a certain way. It needs a certain type of food, needs a certain type of environment, needs very specific care. So how does this equate to what's going on in Europe? Well, in the same way, we know that Italia is having some problems, all right? Italy's got problems, we know that. It's got problems with its sovereign debt, and we know that these sovereign debt problems can actually ripple out through the economy. We've seen this in the past, with Greece and all the rest of it. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen. So what we do is we ring fence Italy. We make sure that its problems don't filter out into Europe. But we ring fence Italy for a second reason, because we want to make sure that we can get in there and protect and deal with Italy in the way it needs to be dealt with in order for it to be brought back online again, to be a thriving economy again. And that prescription is very, very singular to Italy. I mean, it's in a very different situation to, say, Ireland, where consumer debt is very, very high. In Italy, consumer debt is actually quite low, but government debt is very high. So clearly, you need different prescriptions to deal with those situations in a different way, which is why you need to isolate Italy and deal with it in a very specific way. So given that we now understand why we need to ring fence, what does the ring fence actually look like? But Italy's main problem right now is that its borrowing costs are very high. It's actually a solvent economy in almost every other way. It's pretty productive, generates lots of money, but it just can't make its interest payments. Why? Because those interest payments keep going up. Why? Because everyone wants to charge more money to lend to Italy, because they're worried that Italy could go bankrupt down the road. So what that means is that Italy's borrowing costs keep jacking up until it could make it unsustainable. So the way to deal with this is to have for an organization, say the European Central Bank or some other organization, to step in and say, we're going to guarantee Italy's bonds. No matter what happens to Italy, we'll make sure that those bonds are good. We'll pay the money back. Suddenly there's no problem with Italy's bonds. Everyone's happy to buy them all day long. That's going to bring the cost of borrowing down. Italy's going to be in much better shape at that point. Now it can look in on itself and focus on the problems that it has internally. And those are too much government debt and a very stringent and archaic regulatory system that actually stops companies from being competitive and being productive. So it wants to change that so it can bring more tax revenue in, make it easier for it to balance its budget. Now, if Italy doesn't do that, if it can't get a ring fence up, then there's a real danger. Firstly, a danger that its problems are going to bleed out into the rest of Europe and cause this cascading effect, because it's not going to be able to reform its industries inside. Secondly, that cascading effect could ripple out all the way through the European nations, possibly through the US, through a banking crisis, possibly through Asia too. And if that happens, it'll leave all of us very badly needing a drink.